morning! Welcome back to Stories with Pastor Macy. I just got done reading this book, Persnickety, to all of you, but then I looked at my microphone and it had a red dot flashing, which means it's on mute. So, I read a whole story on mute. Let's read it again. I love this book, Persnickety. It is written by Stephen Cosgrove and illustrated by Robin James. And I have been trying to wait and find a morning when maybe it was a little colder and we needed to wear fuzzy socks, because socks are a part of this story. But in Oregon, it is summertime, and so it is getting warmer every day, and we don't need to wear fuzzy socks. But if where you are it is cold, if your air conditioning is on high, run and get a pair of socks, because socks are a big part of Persnickety's life. Are you ready to read the story? All right, here we go. Persnickety by Stephen Cosgrove. Once, in a land of magic mountains and dreams, there lived some mighty dragons in a shadowy valley called Old Dragon Hollow. Here, the dragons lived deep in a cave carved from crystal coal. Here they hid from idle passerbys who might have laughed, leered, or jumped in fear at the mighty dragons that lived in Old Dragon Hollow. The dragons couldn't really scare anyone, for if you looked carefully, you would note that all the dragons wore woolly socks upon their feet to keep their toes warm on cold crystal cave nights. Nothing is very scary about a dragon who wears socks. Now, the dragons that lived in Old Dragon Hollow were a sloppy lot. Sticks and bones from forgotten meals were strewn hither and thither and gnawn about the entrance of the cave. A bit of this and a bit of that was cast about. Why, they even left their dirty woolly socks draped across rocks. Old Dragon Hollow was a mess, and so were the mighty dragons who lived there. The dragons would sprawl about in the warm summer sun, dreaming of nights and battles and days gone by. Occasionally, a dragon or two would burp a bit of oily smoke, and they didn't even say, "Excuse me." Old Dragon Hollow was a sorry sight indeed. Not all of the dragons were sloppy, however, for one of the dragons was as clean could be, and he was called Persnickety. His shiny green scales were combed and oiled to a shiny sheen. His face was scrubbed until it nearly glowed. Around his neck he wore a perfectly tied bow tie. Always clean, always neat, always tied, and on his feet he always wore a clean pair of checkered, ironed socks. Persnickety spent most of his days trying to clean up after the other dragons. With an armful of dirty socks, he would waddle to the stream to wash them all as the other dragons ate another messy meal of grease, glop, and bone. Now, it wasn't that the other dragons didn't appreciate the things that Persnickety did. It was just that they didn't care if the things were messy or not. If they were to choose, they preferred messy more. One day, the little pristine dragon became very angry. "That's it!" he cried as he threw down a pile of rubbish. "I'll wash not another sock. I will pick up nary another bone. If all of you wish to act like pigs, then you should live like them too." "Man, thanks, Persnickety," they all shouted in glee as they began throwing food at one another. "We're just as happy dirty as you are clean." "Well," Persnickety exclaimed, "if that's the way you feel, then I am moving far away indeed." The other dragons thought about it a moment or two and then chorused, "Okay," and went back to their food fight. Persnickety rushed into the cave and carefully packed all of his belongings. He packed his ties, several handkerchiefs with his initials stitched on one side, all of his checkered stockings, his toothbrush, and his favorite bar of soap. After all was packed, he nattily washed his hands and face, put on a clean pair of socks, picked up his bag, and carefully stepped around the sleeping dragons. The wind whispered cleanly through the trees as Persnickety walked away from Old Dragon Hollow and into the valley of streams and dreams. "Oh, what a delightful valley!" he shouted in glee as he walked beside crystal waters of the stream. "It's all so neat and clean. Oh, it is so perfect!" Persnickety walked and walked, looking at all the perfection around him. He stopped to smell some bright red roses, but as he touched the stem of the rose, a thorn pricked his finger. He thought, "It's pretty perfect, but not perfect enough. When I build my perfect little house, I shall pluck all the thorns from these roses, and then they'll be perfect too." Persnickety picked a perfect spot on a perfect knoll to build his perfect house. He only used perfect stones and sticks from which to build his perfect little house. When he was done, the house was perfectly square with perfect little windows and a perfect little door. He stood back to examine all the perfection that he had perfected, and when he backed into a thorn of one of those pesky roses. "Ouch!" he cried. "Well, little flowers, it's your turn now." For the rest of the day he picked and plucked all the nasty thorns from the bright red roses that grew about his little cottage. "There," he said as he dusted his hands carefully clean. "Now I have perfect flowers around my perfect house in a perfect part of the world." Then he walked inside to begin living his perfectly perfect life. But all was not perfect, for Persnickety had no one to admire all his perfection. He moped about the meadow and finally came up with a marvelous plan. "I shall throw a perfect party. I'll invite all the dragons from Old Dragon Hollow, and then they shall see how perfect a clean life can be." He dashed inside and neatly wrote out an invitation to all the dragons. Then he rushed about making perfect sandwiches and a perfect cake for the perfect party. When all was done, he set neatly on the table, he slipped into his bed with its crisply ironed sheets and tightly tucked blankets, and fell into a perfect sleep, where he dreamed of clean and folded things. The next day, like a rumbling summer storm, all the dragons rambled into the valley of streams and dreams. They rollicked and frolicked and had a delightful time throwing food and draping their socks all over the house. They wrestled on the floor, ate all the food and threw it, and burped in great gales of laughter. All in all, the dragons had a perfect party. All of them, that is, except Persnickety, who rushed about picking up all that they threw down. "Wipe your feet, use a napkin, don't touch, don't look, just don't!" Persnickety shouted as he rushed from one end of the house to the other and cleaned up all the spills that were made. The dragons tore up the inside of the house, and then they rushed outside. Now, dragons love to eat rosebuds, but they usually don't because of the thorns. Persnickety's roses had no thorns, and they were able to pick and eat the blossoms, and the roses they didn't eat they threw about. Finally, Persnickety could stand no more, and he stood in the door and roared, "Stop! You have ruined my perfect party!" The dragons froze like messy statues, and then one of them spoke. "No, I don't think so. The party was perfect in part because we had fun." But, stammered Persnickety, "my perfect house is in shambles, and you have picked all my perfect roses too." "Yeah," said the dragon with a dumb smile on his face. "We could never pick the bright red roses before because of the thorns, but you have made them perfect." With that, he picked the final rose and popped it into his mouth and ate it. Now that the party was over, the dragons put back on their oddly matched, soiled socks and rolled like a dust storm back to their home in Old Dragon Hollow. They left behind a monstrous mess. Everywhere Persnickety looked, there was no perfection. His bed was tossed and turned, there was jam and jelly stuck to the ceiling, why there was even a dirty sock draped about the leftover cake. With grim resolve never to have a perfect party again, Persnickety began to clean up the mess. He cleaned and cleaned all through the night, buffing and shining everything bright. Then at morning's light, he stepped outside and looked at his once again perfect house. But all was not perfect. For the roses that had grown so perfectly were torn and trampled down. Persnickety sat down with a thump and a puff of dust. With a small trickling tear sliding down his cheek, he picked up a tattered rose. He stifled a sob as he looked and looked at the tattered rose. But the more he thought about the party, the more he found perfection in all the mess. He began to giggle as he realized that perfection is only perfection if you have something to compare it to. What better to compare a perfect house to than the dragon's perfect mess? He laughed and laughed as he swept up the flowers. The party was perfect in a dirty, dusty sort of way. Those dragons are sort of perfect. The roses would have lived if I had only left on the thorns. With that, he dashed around his garden and carefully taped a thorn onto every bush. From that day forward, Persnickety threw parties, and all the dragons came, just as messy as could be. They ate and threw the food. They jumped upon the bed, but they never ate the roses bright, bright red. For the stem of every rose was adorned with imperfect thorns that made each flower even more perfect. Perfectly perfect is good, or so the story goes. But nature, left all on her own, will make a perfect rose. The end. I love this story because I think it describes a lot of what happens in the church. We, as perfectly imperfect humans, sometimes think that if we just go to another church, another congregation, if we just find people who are more like us, who like to be clean, who wear their perfectly tied bow ties or whatever it might be, that then everything will be perfectly perfect. But we're human. And so we come with baggage. We come with messes. And I like Persnickety's approach to things. He continues throwing parties. He continues having the messy dragons of Old Dragon Hollow in his life and over to his home, even though he knows that it'll bring a mess, that it'll bring dirty socks and a food fight. But he takes his friends as he finds them. He doesn't try to change them and make them just like him. He accepts them in their perfect mess. And you know what? Jesus loves each one of us, and he accepts us in our messes. Whether our mess is that we're trying to be perfectly perfect, or that we have some slop and glop and old bones laying around and dirty socks on our feet, Jesus accepts us as we are and wants to be friends with us and wants to be in our life no matter what. And I hope that we can be a little bit more like Persnickety. Whatever's going on in our lives, I hope that we can invite people into our lives and into our church and love on them no matter what's happening in their life. I like this line in the book. The more he, Persnickety, thought about the party, the more he found perfection in all the mess. We are perfect messes, And God loves us because of that. Not in spite of it, but because of it. So as you go about your perfectly perfect day or your perfectly messy day, I hope that you will remember Persnickety and remember the fact that he giggled and laughed at the big mess and at the perfectly messiness of his dragon friends, and that you will treat others with respect and understanding and maybe laugh at yourself a little bit. Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.